Welcome into college football overtime. My name is Garrett Chapman. My co-host Abe Gordon is here with me as we are getting ready to react to all of the craziness that just unfolded on Sunday. We have our a slate of four teams decided after championship weekend. Abe, I know we talked about on last Thursday's podcast. We said specifically after Saturday's games, we would have a very clear idea of who was going to be playing in the college football playoff, and I don't think we had that. I don't think that ended up happening. We had a little bit of chaos, and we're going to talk about that chaos right here on the College Football Overtime podcast. And then we're going to give you our reactions to what ended up happening in the college football playoff poll, and we're going to give you our thoughts as to whether we think that was the right or wrong decision. Abe, before we do any of that, what are your thoughts, man? What are you feeling?
Well, a little bit of surprise just in general about how a couple different games played themselves out. We'll get to them shortly. And then a little bit of less surprise on the actual four teams that are going to be playing for a championship over the next month and change. I thought there was an opportunity to be surprised, but the committee did not see it the same way. So here we are, and we'll break it all down.
Yeah, we sure will. And we're actually going to start out there on the West Coast. The first game of the week on Friday, Bo Nix versus Michael Penix, both of the quarterbacks vying for a potential Heisman Trophy. And I don't know if we necessarily won one on the football field that day, but maybe somebody who wasn't playing on the field that day ended up securing it. That guy, his name is Jaden Daniels. But Michael Penix outdueled Bo Nix. Now Bo Nix finishes his career 0-7 against teams that say go Dogs. More importantly, he was 0-2 against Washington this season.
Yeah, it was very interesting to me. We had these expectations coming into the game, and it certainly didn't look that way from the very beginning. Just the real question is just where's this Washington team been for like the last 7 games or however long it's been since they beat Oregon the first time? We all felt they were a good team. We felt they could be complete. We felt they could beat Oregon, but they hadn't looked that way on the field against subpar competition. But look, when the bright lights came on at Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, they were ready to go from the opening whistle. They jumped out to an early lead. It went back and forth throughout the second half, and they had to make some plays down the stretch to win a tight game.
Yeah.
But it was just one of those things where, like, it's good to see this team again because it had been slipping away from them almost, but they gathered themselves right at the right time. And you look to carry this momentum because they look like a completely different team. Talking about Washington, they had the run game going. Obviously, I spoke about it before. Jalen McMillan, getting him back, does a lot of things for Michael Penix, who will now have 3 weeks with a very good coach to prepare for their conference, their college football semifinal. It was just unexpected from the aspect of I know that team is good. And I know they could look the way they looked, but they just hadn't looked that way. And so it does a few things, right? It tells you that you go back to the original game with Oregon, and with a lot of pressure was placed on Dan Lanning for some of the decisions, but that was not a fluke win. There were some arguments that could have been made based on how that game played out, that it was a fluke win, the wrong team won, the better team was still Oregon, all of that stuff. And I think Friday night showed you that Washington is still there, and they're going to be a real threat heading into the college football playoffs.
Yeah, and I think people, for whatever reason, just continued to sleep on this football team. And I talked about it specifically. And look, I was one of those people. I picked Oregon State to win. I picked Oregon to win this game too. So I'm not saying it. I'm not throwing stones at other positions. I'm starting here with myself. This is Washington at its best. It's when Washington is on the biggest stage. And honestly, there's something to be said about that. This is a team that when the going got toughest, that's when they showed up. And they just sort of consistently would show up in the biggest moments. And I called it the clutch factor. Michael Penix is like when we previewed this game last Thursday, what I said is, like, it's almost like it's like people looked at what their record was in close games and used it as almost as a detriment. I said the opposite. Like, maybe this is a strength. Maybe this is just the team that they are. Maybe they're the team who needs to, that's just the way that they motivate themselves. I don't know. But They've won what their last eight games or something like that by one score or less, or 10 or fewer points, or something like that. And this is a team that knows how to win football games, and there is a credit to doing that. And Michael Penix, dude, has just been a baller, and he showed up in the biggest moment in this game when they needed points. He drove them down the field, and they got those points. And then when they needed to just keep a drive alive, he did the exact same thing for them there. And now Washington is going to go to the well, not the Rose Bowl. They're actually going to go to the Sugar Bowl, which I feel is kind of silly just in and of itself. But they're going to be down in the Sugar Bowl playing Texas, and we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But look, this was a big game. Bo Nix, of course, he falls on the biggest stage, and Dan Lanning, you mentioned it. Just a disappointing performance from these guys. And really, it came down to their inability to run the football for me. They finished this game with 124 yards on the ground. It's great, but 69 of those yards came from your quarterback, and that's not good. Bucky Irving was somebody who you need him to be bigger in these games. And you saw one team get it from Dylan Johnson, 28 carries, 152 yards, 2 touchdowns, stepped up at the very end of that game. And I think if Michael Penix hadn't been the quarterback of this team, he probably is your MVP of that game. But Jalen McMillan, Rome Odunze, like they got dudes, man. That's just what they are. And I think it makes for a fascinating matchup in the semifinal. Of course, I keep teasing at it, but it's because I really want to talk about it. But we're almost there. I got to save myself for that one. But no, this was a great football game. This was the game that the Pac-12 deserved. It's their curtain call. I don't know if you saw it on social media. All of the mascots there on the sideline, they're all dancing. This really was the end of the Pac-12. And that was kind of an emotional moment for a lot of people I saw on social media. And like a lot of people were like really came to terms with it in that moment. But look, man, we got Pac-12 After Dark one last time.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't look at this as emotional or anything. I could care less, to be honest. That's down the road. It
Have
does
you no
nothing
heart?
for me. This was a game about one team playing their way into the college football playoffs unequivocally and undeniably. The winner of this game was going to hold a spot, whether it was Oregon, whether it was Washington. And like you said, Washington stepped up in the big moments. It's not the first time Penix has done that this season, may not be the last, but they played their way in over the course of the season and over the course of one game in the Pac-12 championship. They absolutely deserve to be where they are. It'll be interesting to see them against a tough opponent in, as you mentioned, the Sugar Bowl.
Yep. And so let's move on to something else that we saw coming up on Saturday, a game that we talked about on our show, college football game time that broadcasts every single Saturday with our friend John Fricky on Sports Radio 92.9 The Game in Atlanta. The Big 12 championship game, Texas and Oklahoma State. This one was a bit of a laugher. We kind of predicted that this was going to be the way that this unfolded. The edges just weren't there for Oklahoma State. The things that they do well just so happen to be the very things that Texas also does really well, and they do it better than Oklahoma State does. Ollie Gordon, of course, he finishes this game with 34 rushing yards. He, at one point, was slamming his helmet down on the sideline. He was just very frustrated because he expected a little bit more from his guys. And look, I understand that you're a competitor, but you were out of your depth. And not him in particular, but I'm just saying Oklahoma State. Texas just had them from the get-go. Like it was over from the very beginning of the game. And all respect to Gundy's crew, I really liked Oklahoma State. They were one of my picks to play in this game at the beginning of the season. But I think we saw from them just the sheer the distance between these two programs in terms of talent on the football field. The playmakers really showed up for Texas in a big way. Quinn Ewers, of course, is the stud, and that's who everyone probably will and should be talking about. But A.D. Mitchell had a big game. Xavier Worthy had a big game. Like everybody across the board, great football game. The stars showed out in the biggest way, in the biggest stage.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is an atrocious Oklahoma State defense. We knew that going in. Yeah. I said going in, I don't know how Texas isn't in the 40s. They almost got to the 50s. Probably could have if they throttled, kept the foot on the gas there. And the other aspect of this is, like, it feel bad for Oklahoma State because Sarkisian and Texas, they knew they wanted to make a statement and try and impress. Ultimately, it probably didn't matter. If they had won this game by 7 or won this game by the 28 points that they did.
Yeah.
But there was nothing Oklahoma State could do to stop them. And you knew they were going to try and pile up the points. And so that's where we were. It was a good performance, an outstanding first half from Texas, but not ultimately surprising. Oklahoma State's one of the worst defenses in
Yeah.
the Power Five. They were certainly the worst defense of any team that made the conference championship weekend. And as you mentioned, the Texas run D came in 5th in the country, and probably somehow improved those stats against a back like Ollie Gordon. So this was non-competitive from the opening drive, and Texas advances into the playoffs as well.
They sure do. It was only the 4th Big 12 title for the Longhorns in their first since 2009, which feels a little weird to say. It's been a long time coming for the Longhorn Nation, and they chanted SEC as the commissioner, Brett Yormark, addressed the crowd, and it felt a little weird. Two consecutive championship games that we're talking about where the champion is actually leaving and abandoning the conference and going somewhere else next year. Just the state of college football and the affairs that we are in right now. But these are just two teams at a different level, and I think that became clear. Texas has been the class of the Big 12 all season, outside of the one blip on the radar in the Red River Shootout against Oklahoma, which I guess at this point you really can call almost a blip on the radar because they've been a pretty much a freight train just about most of the season. They've had a couple down weeks where they've struggled at times, and maybe they let some people creep back into football games. And I think that makes for a very interesting game coming up on January 1st. And of course, we're going to get into that here in just a minute. But we're going to come back to Atlanta, the game of the weekend, I would say. Georgia and Alabama. The Crimson Tide of Alabama take down the reigning national champions 27-24 in a game that, honestly, I watched the first drive for Georgia, and I said, oh boy, here we go. And I thought that was going to be the tone that was going to be set for the rest of the game. I thought that was going to be what we saw. And because they just sort of walked down the field. They tripped down the field after a quick 3 and out that they kind of shut down Jalen Milroe. And then all of a sudden, they couldn't do anything on offense. They have a 3 and out, and they punt. They 3 and out, and they punt. Then you have the 13-play drive where it looked like they were finally putting pieces back together. Then you have the penalty, and then you miss a field goal. And then all of a sudden, it's the end of the half, and you're down 17-7. It was a weird type of game for Georgia. They looked, I didn't say they're sleepwalking because they just got bullied, really, in this game. The line of scrimmages, Alabama controlled the line of scrimmage. We talked to BA before the game, Brendan Adams of Dog Nation, and we talked specifically about how dominating on the line of scrimmage is going to be important. And Cole Kublik as well from SEC Network on Saturday. And he said, if you win in the line of scrimmage, you're going to win this football game. And that's the biggest thing. And that's consistently been the biggest factor in this game. Everyone talks about Bryce Young and Stetson Bennett and all of the quarterbacks and all the great players who have come through this program, or both of these programs. But it's the trenches that really define this game. They really always have. And Alabama dominated Georgia in the trenches on Saturday. And that was pretty evident after the first drive. They were getting a push on the offensive line, and then the defensive line. I don't think that they ever sent pressure, but they were containing the Georgia rushing attack with just 4 guys. And at the end of the day, like, that comes down to the secondary that's willing to tackle. It comes down to guys who are doing their job and dominating gap assignments. They held Georgia to 78 rushing yards on this game. And if you told me that before the game, that's a stat that you can take that to the bank. Because Georgia's not winning that football game if they run for only 78 yards. Kendall Milton was shut down. Dejan Edwards was shut down. It was just a weird effort, a weird game if you're Georgia.
Yeah, it was. It was surprising, I think would be the word for me, because of how it looked, because of the domination along the fronts that you're referencing. That was what was most surprising to me. I think Georgia actually did a pretty good job in pass protection, but they could not create the holes that they had been creating in the run game. You're absolutely correct on that. And then on the flip side, I don't think the Georgia defensive line has been pushed backwards like that in 2.5 years. Before. Well, we've seen it, but not since they started
Not on this run.
Right. It's been 2 years since they've been moved off that line, and first contact for running backs are coming multiple yards down the field. There's no doubt about that. Look, you thought maybe the run game would be an advantage because you weren't facing Jace McClellan, and you look at the numbers. You held Jalen Milroe in check in terms of him using his legs, but Roydell Williams, Jam Miller combined to do some damage. And look, the numbers aren't staggering for the run game, but there was a part of this game, the early part of this game, where Alabama and Nick Saban and Jalen Milroe couldn't get it going through the air. and they switched to a run-heavy attack, and it really settled things down for them.
Yeah.
That was that stretch of game in the late first quarter into the stretch of the second quarter really settled it down and solidified things for Alabama. And then, look, we talked about it. Georgia's not going to let Jalen Milroe beat them deep, and they didn't do that. What we didn't expect was Jalen Milroe to settle in and actually find some intermediate passing to do some real damage. Isaiah Bond was a big contributor. Nothing deep for him, but a lot of stuff over the middle, a lot of third down, or not necessarily third down conversions, but first down catches, as it were, and including one important one near the end of the first half that was, a little questionable to some. Could have changed, how the rest of the game played out. I won't say it changed the outcome of the game. I think that's too big of a step to take, but it certainly changes how the rest of the game does play out if Alabama doesn't get that late touchdown there in the first half. But this was, and look, I know we all want to take these grand storylines. The Saban's not dead yet, and back to the drawing board for Kirby. And look, we knew this Georgia team wasn't dominant like they had been in years past. You also can't hide behind the fact that Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey were well below 100%. There's no denying that. That certainly hurts what they were able to do offensively. But at the end of the day, there were concerns about this Georgia defense all year long. It has not looked like the Georgia defense of years past, and they've been able to get by. But they met another team, and this is, we talked about it. There's another team out there that has a talent level comparable to Georgia's. It was Alabama. And the parts where Georgia has its most pride, Alabama does too. And you mentioned it along those lines. That was the big difference in the game. You can talk about the abilities of Bowers and McConkey and where they were physically. You could talk about Jalen Milroe and what he can and can't do with his arm. You could talk about the two coaches. You could talk about special teams all you want. It came down to the trenches, and specifically for me, in the run game. Georgia could not run the ball. You're absolutely right about that. Alabama not only could run the ball, and it wasn't the hugest successful run day. They didn't go 200 yards or anything, but it was an important time for them to find first downs and run the ball and kind of establish some momentum. And they were able to do that, which I didn't necessarily see coming with Jason McClellan out of the game. And it, I know Georgia didn't show panic, Garrett. I want to get your thoughts, but you have to imagine that there's a scenario where they can't believe that they're being pushed backwards in this manner. And there's not really a response to it. There's not really a way to stem the tide coming downhill on you. And they really never, it's not, I don't know if there was an adjustment to be made. I'm not a coach. I'm not a scout. I don't pretend to know what I'm looking for. I don't know how they were supposed to adjust off of that, because man for man, they were getting pushed backwards. And that's something that these guys probably have never dealt with in their Georgia football career.
No. And we saw that really in the first half, not as much in the second half.
Right.
Outside of the one drive that you had in the fourth quarter. And then obviously the one that sealed the game. But I think you said it, you had a good point specifically. It's not that Jalen Milroe or they were just like killing him or anything like that. It just felt like every time they needed a play, that play happened. Like there would be 3rd and 7 or something. And then all of a sudden, like there was like a play that would break out to the other side and he'd leak out. And then all of a sudden he can jog to the first line marker and just run out of bounds. And it was just little things like that constantly. And that was the thing that I wasn't expecting out of this game. If you go back to what we talked about on Thursday, I said specifically, I was like, hey, if you're Georgia, you want Jalen Milroe in this offense to have to drive on you, because I don't think that they can. Well, they got the plays and they drove on Georgia. And look, at the end of the day, Alabama won this game outright. They were the better football team on Saturday. And then I could tell probably by the end of like the midway through the third quarter, I was like, this game feels like
it felt like unless you got a turnover,
it felt like they needed a play to happen.
Yeah,
I thought they had that play at the start of the fourth quarter where they had that big drive and Carson Beck drove them down the field, and then they cut the deficit to 3,
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, this is it. All right, so they're back in the game. This is this is what they needed, and now all they need to do is get a stop. And then Alabama drives down the field just 75 yards, and then it's just over. And that's what it felt like. It was like, okay, this is over. But then Carson Beck comes back, and they get the drive. They drive it all the way back down, and then they need to stop, and then they couldn't get a stop, which doesn't feel like Georgia. Like that doesn't feel like the team that we kind of got to know a little bit over the course of this season. It feels like whenever they would need a big play, they were always able to come up with that play, and that's just what great teams do. But this is another great team, and I think the thing that Alabama has that they've had since the benching really of Jalen Milroe, since that USF game, is they've had to play in the clutch, just like Michael Penix in Washington. This is a team that's had to play in the clutch. They struggled with Arkansas. They struggled with Texas A&M. They struggled with Tennessee at times up until the second half. They struggled with they really did struggle with Ole Miss a good bit. Like they struggled with Auburn, and they needed a miracle. But what that does to you is it gives you confidence. That gives you confidence that in those biggest moments, you know that you've already stepped up and you can do it again. This is not a position that we've really seen Georgia in against a competently or adequately talented team, like a team that's comparable to what they are. We saw that against Auburn, but not really. Like it wasn't really like a do or die. Like at that game, there was a period where it's like, oh wow, they could lose this game. But then it's like, but there was never that moment. Wow, they are not the better team today. Like there was never that moment. Alabama's been in that moment probably a dozen times this season, but they always found a way to win. And that gives you confidence over the course of a season, because then you just continuously find that way to come out on top. And that's what they did on Saturday.
Yeah, they did, and it was. I got the same feeling you did, where I'm thinking, okay, Georgia's been in this situation; they're going to need to make a comeback. But I agree. You come back against Auburn because you're the better team. You
Yeah.
come back against South Carolina because you're the better team. It's going to be very difficult to come back against Alabama because you're at least even, if not watching or being opposed by a better team, at least on that day. And again, I do think the limitations for Bowers and McConkey play their role, and some of the officiating plays their role. But at the end of the day, you just got out physical, and there was just no response to it. And look, obviously everyone knows it's no spoiler. UGA is not in the playoffs, but I think that's going to serve this experience for Alabama is going to serve them well in the playoffs, because they're going to need to be just as physical at least two more times.
They're going to need to be very physical in this upcoming game against Michigan. And of course, we're going to get to that preview here in just a second. But speaking of Michigan, let's move into the Big Ten championship game, a game that I don't have too many thoughts on, because I don't think Iowa, you see that little goose egg right there. That offense is terrible.
I thought their defense set them up.
The defense played really well. Look, the defense played
was
really
so
well.
close.
The defense played really well. Yeah, they sure did. And then they had the one. So we talked specifically, we said that they had to dominate on defense, and that they had to win special teams, and they looked like they were not in control of this game, but they looked like they had a handle on it. And they pretty much contained Michigan for the most part. And then all of a sudden you have the 87-yard punt return. And that at that point, I was like, oh, okay, that was the play that needed to go in their favor. That was one of those plays where Michigan needs to try to recover that ball or return the punt, and then the ball gets punched out, and then you run it the other way. That was the kind of play that was going to need to go their way. And when I saw that, I think it was like halfway through the first quarter, it kind of felt like they just sort of shrunk back into their shell a little bit. It looked like they were playing a little loose, and then after that play happened, they shrunk back, and then it's like, all right, yeah, now we're out of our depth, and it felt like the game was already out of reach. JJ McCarthy though doesn't really play all that well. This is a good defense, but 147 yards, it's nothing great. He's not really throwing the ball down the field. I think that's going to be a very interesting matchup against Alabama. I'm really interested to see what that happens there. But Blake Corum, of course, scores 2 touchdowns. He just continues to be the ultimate goal line predator. I think he has 24 touchdowns now, and I think 23 of them have come within 5 yards of the line of the goal line. The ultimate goal line running back. But they win this game 26-0. Iowa really doesn't get a lot of anything. Deacon Hill, though, I will say, I'll give him credit. He surpassed his season average. He had 120 yards. And he went over the century mark.
Yeah, I think it's a situation, and I'm not going to look into the stats too much in this one. I think Michigan knew as long as we protect the ball, we're going to win this game. It was over at 10-0. At least that's how it felt to me.
Yeah.
And so when you look at McCarthy, it's just, hey, no chances. If 50% passer, then so be it. Under 150 yards passing, then so be it. No chances. No 50-50 throws, no tight windows. Because that's the only way Iowa can compete in this game. And so I'm not concerned with the stats there. This was a dominant effort. It was always going to be a dominant effort. It was over once it was 10-0. And look, for Michigan, you had a couple of warm-ups and tune-ups in Penn State and then obviously Ohio State. And you're just going to have to rely on your ability in those games against better teams because Iowa's never a threat in this game.
No, it really wasn't that kind of situation. It was interesting, though, that Jim Harbaugh chooses not to accept the Big Ten championship trophy at the end of the game. I think we all know why that happened. He sort of wore that scarlet letter on his chest and wore it proudly. But Michigan, of course, they move on to your number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff. This was never really a contest. I don't think anybody ever took this game super seriously. Iowa, if Iowa ever one of these days puts together a competent offense, and I don't mean like a good offense, I mean just one that can give you, I don't know, something of any level of consistency.
The best offenses in college are scoring 40 to 45 a game. If Iowa can put up one, then get you 24 points.
This is a team that could really be pretty damn good.
Yeah.
And because
they can just get an average offense at 24, 25 a game in college, which isn't crazy.
Not that crazy.
And look, that's what the number was for Brian Ferentz to retain
25.
his job, was 25. I mean, that's what you're asking. If they get one of those, they're going to be a top 10 team.
Yeah, and they obviously couldn't get that done. But let's move into the ACC Championship. Probably one of the more controversial endings here. Louisville falls to Florida State 16-6. Really, the story of this game is Brock Glenn, the backup to the backup, the freshman starter, 8 of 21, 55 yards, 2.6 yards per completion. Not a great game for Florida State. Not really a great game at all, but Lawrence Tuafili, 118 yards for that young man. He was really the biggest reason that they won this game. It felt like it was a slugfest for a long time. 2 pretty good defenses. I know Florida State has a strong defense. I don't even know the last time they had a lot of touchdown. It doesn't feel like it was did they allow a touchdown against Florida?
Yeah.
They did? Okay. Never mind. So it was just this game that they did that. And look, but this was a really strong defense for Florida State. And they kind of flexed their muscle. Jared Verse and company. They had a great game.
If you say so, I think this is more about a pathetic Louisville offense than a really good Florida State defense, if we're being honest. I will say this. I think Florida State knew that this game had to be defensively like it was. They needed to do everything in their powers to do exactly what they did against Louisville and keep this a very low-scoring game. They could not rely on their offense to bail them out. There's no denying that. And they didn't. But I'm not going to take a look at this game and say, oh, man, what a dominant defense.
Well, hey, they had 7 sacks, 14 tackles for losses.
Yeah, like I said, it's a pitiful performance from Notre Dame, or excuse me, from Louisville. I think
they've been exposed these last 2 weeks.
I mean, that's kind of where I'm at, is like, I watched a couple Louisville games earlier in the year. I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, Jack Plummer's pretty careless with the ball. He doesn't do there's a lot of things he doesn't do well, but they are getting the ball to Jordan and Thrash in space. And I was like, are they going to keep this up? Is it fluky? What's going on here? And look, I'm not taking a dump on the Florida State defense. It's a very good unit, among the best in the country. But this was more, to me, this is more about just pathetic from Louisville, and maybe the weather got them. Maybe the injury bug still is biting them a little bit, but you expect more from any of the teams, with the exception of Iowa, of course, that are in conference championship games. You expect more than 6 points.
It was 3-3. It was 3-3 all the way into the deep end of the third quarter.
Yeah, I actually did not like that they ended up taking the field goal there. I would have gone for the touchdown, but that's just me. Well, I mean, what do you have to lose? You're playing the number 4 team without a quarterback. Look, altogether, this was a good win for Florida State. Obviously, wasn't enough, but this was a good win to wrap up their season, considering the circumstances. The game played out the way it had to play out if they were going to win. They were never going to win a 31-24 type of affair. So kudos to the coaching staff for the game plan and to the defense for ramping it up the way they needed to. But I'm not like leaving this game incredibly impressed with how good Florida State's D was. I'm just not.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those days, man. I mean, it's been one of these last 2 weeks for Florida State have just been brutal. I was at Bobby Dodd Stadium watching of course, I was following what was happening with Florida State, and ACC Network was there, and I looked over and I saw when Jordan Travis got hurt. It was maybe the moment after he got hurt, and then I looked over and saw that. I was like, "Oh, somebody's down. What's going on?" And I felt the collective air go out of the press box because everybody understood the moment of what just happened. In that moment, they understood what happened, and of course, you get the air cast on his leg, and everybody's standing up and watching this happen. And Florida State, since that moment, they just haven't been the same football team. Of course, the defense has played well, and yes, I'm going to give a little bit more credit to the defense because they did hold a Louisville offense that's pretty good and has a pretty strong identity, and they held them and kept them out of their game. They would let them play their game, and they pinned their ears back and got after Jack Plummer and company and shut down the Louisville rushing attack. They did a great job, but at the end of the day, the Florida State identity existed with Jordan Travis, and it's hard to know what they are without that quarterback. And I think we saw that in kind of gruesome display these last 2 weeks. I know we picked against them. Both of us did both weeks. And at the end of the day, like, they come up and they step up in the biggest stage and they do what they need to do, but they're not the same team. And I think that's pretty obvious.
Well, yes, that is obvious. If we're gonna be honest, and I, some of this, I'm like, do I want to hold this till we get into this discussion?
Well, let's go ahead.
I got some thoughts on Florida State here.
All right, so of course we know what's happened. Everybody's seen the rankings. I'm sure if you're watching this podcast or 30 minutes into this podcast, if you're watching this, you pretty much have an understanding of what happened today. You have the number 1 team in America is Michigan. They're going to be taking on Alabama in the Rose Bowl, a pretty controversial decision there, to some at least. Washington is your 2 seed. Texas is going to finish 3rd. Florida State drops to the 5 spot. And Georgia, after winning 29 games in a row in the last 2 national championship games, they lose by 3 points in a conference championship game, and they drop to the 6th spot, which feels a little ridiculous to me, but I understand it. Abe, I know there was no right answer with this. There was no right answer. I understood that there was no way that Georgia was going to make it in. I knew that this SEC championship game was a play-in game. That's really what it was. That's what it has been for a number of years now, with a few exceptions. Generally speaking, the winner gets in and the loser does not. And we saw that play out again on Saturday. Florida State, of course, dropped out. That's the most controversial of all of them. Michigan and Washington, I think those 2 were chalk. Texas, Alabama, of course, they played each other, and that was you couldn't have one without the other. Well, Alabama couldn't make it in and not Texas. I mean, there were a lot of different factors. I know we talked about it a lot. You've seen it all over social media. Abe, I'm just going to give you a chance. Just unload. What do you got?
Well, a couple things here. I mean, obviously, as soon as Texas was 3, you knew Florida State was out. In my opinion, if Florida State was going to be in, they were going to be ranked the 3rd team with a 1-loss Texas behind them. I thought that would have made sense. So as soon as I saw Texas, I knew Florida State was out. Mm-hmm. Basically, and look, the College Football Playoff Committee is never going to tell us exactly what went in specifically. They're going to use their code words. They're going to talk about whatever. Here's what happened. This was a scenario in which they were going to tick off someone. There's no denying that. There's 3 teams for 2 spots. Georgia's not one of them. They were going to tick off someone. So what did they do? They took the path of least resistance. They kept the team out that would anger the fewest people. Essentially is how this played out. And look, I'm not even sure that it's the wrong decision. It's not the decision I would have made. No. I stand on that in terms of an undefeated Power 5 champion should have been given the opportunity to play. But they're going to use their arguments to say this is not the same team as they were with Jordan Travis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I get that. But here's the other thing. If Florida State's a 3 seed, they're a 8-point underdog to Washington. If Florida State's the 4 seed, they're a 13-point underdog to Michigan. That's with Jordan Travis. They weren't going to be competitive. And I think that's the argument that people are going to make when defending the committee is like, did you really want to see Florida State take on this team or that team? We already know the result. Look, the teams we have at 3 and 4, Texas and Alabama, I don't know the results of these semifinal games. If it was Florida State, I know what the result would have been. Florida State would have been out and someone else is advancing. And so when we get to the discussion of was this the right decision, did they take the 4 best teams, et cetera, et cetera? Like those are very easy arguments to make because I don't know a single person, even Florida State fans, who are like, yeah, man, we're going to beat Michigan if you'd given us a shot. Like, your quarterback can't throw the forward pass. Like, no, you're not. And so I understand the reasoning behind it. It to me is still the easy way out. And sometimes I throw this word around maybe a little too cavalierly. But this was a coward's decision. They took the easy way out. I think it would have been a lot bolder and braver to take a stance that this was an undefeated Power 5 champion, whether they're going to get blown out in the semifinals or not. I thought it was the right decision to make. But ultimately, I'm not surprised it's not the one that they made. Again, it's an easier stance to defend leaving them out than it is to defend keeping them in, especially in a couple weeks from now when you'd have to actually play that game and they may just be completely and wholly outmatched. And then everyone starts finger pointing. It should have been Alabama. It should have been Texas, whatever. I understand why this is the decision they made. But I still think it would have, I'm not getting any intrinsic value out of this. Like, I don't really care. Like, I think the games they've set up are going to be great.
Yeah.
But for me, it just would have felt right to put them in, whether they're getting blown out or not. It felt like they earned it more than anyone else. And I don't have an argument against that. I know you can show me the strength of schedule and you can show me the ranked opponents. They did what they're supposed to do. The other teams didn't. That's the bottom line at the end of the day. So I thought they should have been given the chance. And if they get blown out, they get blown out. And look, they were going to get blown out. There's no way around that. And so I understand the decision. But the biggest issue, which is not even about this discussion, not even about Florida State or Texas or Alabama, the committee refused to diagnose what their actual responsibility and duty was from the very beginning. They never told you, are we taking the best teams, the most deserving teams, the highest ranked teams? Are we doing this based on a resume? They never really dialed it. And I know they wanted the flexibility. But again, that's an easy way out. And obviously it gave them the flexibility to make the decision. Yeah, it gave them
an important thing.
And that's why they're able to maneuver and leave Florida State out. I think it's a shame. Ultimately not surprising though.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is it's not surprising at all. That said. But the thing that bugs me the most is the fact that this is an undefeated Power 5 conference champion. This team is 13-0, and this isn't UCF going 13-0. This isn't Cincinnati going 13-0 or Liberty or one of those other teams. I mean, no, this is Florida State.
Well, the other thing that bugs me is they're making this decision because they know it's the last year of the 14 playoff. and they're not concerned about the precedent. That's the other aspect here.
There is no precedent
where
because you move on and it's over.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If this was 3 years ago and they knew they wouldn't be switching formats for another 3 years, I think Florida State actually does end up in the playoffs. But since they knew that and they could throw that out the window, they made the decision they made.
Yeah, but the thing that bugs me the most is the fact that, like, if Alabama gets eliminated and like Alabama's in that 5 spot, what are those players sitting there thinking? Like, oh, damn it, if we had just beaten Texas. If you're Florida State, what do you do? Like, there isn't anything there because you did everything that you were supposed to do. You did everything that everyone.
Yeah, I don't think demanding you have a better backup is a fair argument.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, we call football. What do they call football? It's the ultimate team sport, right? You call it the ultimate team sport in one side of your mouth, and then say on the other side, "Oh, well, because you lost your quarterback, we don't think that you're a deserving team anymore." I think that's also kind of a there's lunacy inside of that. That's a little ridiculous, right? You cannot on one breath call it the ultimate team sport and then in the next one say that if you lose your quarterback, you shouldn't be considered. I understand how important the quarterback position is. I do. And this isn't the same thing as go back to 2014 when Cordell Jones goes on and wins a national championship for Ohio State. He was the third string quarterback at the time, except he scored 59 points against Wisconsin in their conference championship game. This is not the same situation as that, obviously. Obviously, it's not. But this is still Florida State. This is still an ACC champion. This is still a team that went 13-0. And I think it's disrespectful, truthfully, to a league that had a winning record against the other league that got represented in this playoff. So you say the SEC is intrinsically better. I think that they are. I think top to bottom, they're a better conference. They have a track record. They've clearly been the better conference. For everybody outside of the name of Clemson, they've been a significantly better conference over the course of the last 20 years. But that doesn't change the fact that the ACC had a winning record against the SEC this year. And at the end of the day, it's like you have to look at a lot of these factors. These things should matter. Results on the field should matter. I know we had this conversation on Saturday talking specifically about Texas and Alabama, and if you're like, who would you take between those two? And I know you have the point where Alabama's a better football team now than they were back in September. And I'm like, at this, and that's true. You're exactly right. I completely agree. I think if you line them up right now, I think Alabama's the better team. But the problem is the results on the field should matter. The results on the field have an impact, or they should. And they didn't for Florida State. And that's where I understand they're upset. I understand why they're so upset. I understand their frustrations because they did every single thing right. They did every single thing within their power to be included in this Final Four. And then for some reasons outside of their control, that gets taken away from them. And it's not even because the other teams were also undefeated, because they weren't. It's because somebody has some eye test somewhere and they say that because of X, Y, and Z, you're not going to be included. It's just frustrating. It's frustrating. And I understand where they're coming from with it.
Look, there's no denying what we've seen from Florida State over the last 2 weeks does not deserve to be represented in a national semifinal. Okay, like the Rodemaker start against Florida and Glenn the other night against Louisville. Like there's no denying that team has no business being in the state, and that's what they are leaning on as their argument, right? That's why they're. And look, they're going to hear it from Florida State fans, rightfully so, but they're not hearing it from everyone else. And that's the key here. And that's why they're making the decision that they made is they'll take the bite from one school. They don't have to take the bite out of the entire country, because if it was not Alabama, if it was not Texas, and Florida State goes and plays with Glenn and Rodemaker and gets annihilated, people are going to be upset that they could have seen a better game or could have seen a different winner. But I tend to agree with you. Ultimately, I wanted to give them a chance to prove what you said, that they're more than just one player, and that they are a team built on perfection with a 13-0 record. And look, if they fall short, they fall short, right? Like we've seen blowouts in the semifinals before. There've been arguments for
the average margin of victory.
18
points.
No, right. And so If they're the next one on that list, then so be it. I think it was gross to deprive them of at least the opportunity
Yes.
to go out. And again, it was, in my opinion, that game would have been ugly. Okay. I mean, it would have been bad, right? They scored 16 points against Louisville. I know that was third string. That Rodemaker should be back for.
Yeah.
But they only scored 20 something against. Like I get that it's going to be bad. They still deserve the opportunity to go out there, and if they get their butts beat, they get their butts beat.
The ultimate
But
team sport.
It's very disturbing. And again, this will all be remedied next year when you have the 12-team playoff. I get that. But when you go out there and your goal every year and you're told if you win every game, you can win a championship. And they've won every game and can no longer win a championship. And you've got situations where there are other teams that did not win every game and are being preferred. And look, maybe it's money. Maybe it's program, maybe it's conference bias, whatever it is. I understand the committee's decision, but I would have been bolder if I were on the committee. I would have taken a different stance, and you deal with the criticism. Again, this to me felt like they're trying to find a way to deal with the least amount of the criticism. That's not what your job is.
Yeah,
your job is to decide the 4 teams of the college football playoffs with a sliding scale of metrics that it's bogus that conferences and fans have let them get away without defining what 4 teams deserve to be in. Unequivocally, are we taking the 4 most
because
deserving?
Abe, you cannot possibly tell
why,
me. You cannot possibly tell me that the University of Georgia is not one of the 4 best teams in America. You cannot. Nobody can possibly convince me of that fact.
So who are you kicking out? But then who
that's my point. But that's my point. They don't deserve it. I'm not trying to say that they do.
But even
if
if
they're a better team, I think that they're a better team than anybody like of those 4 teams like that are in there. I think they're better. They lost on Saturday, so that's why they lost their opportunity. And look, at the end of the day, the better team doesn't always win. Like that's not what I'm saying. And look, Alabama was the better team on Saturday, and that's why Alabama's in the college football playoff and Georgia's not. But at the end of the day, it's like the committee wanted to give itself some flexibility, and my hope and prayer is, of course, we're moving into this 12-team field next year. I've expressed to you privately my reservations about it. I've said it on this podcast. I've said it on our station at 92.9 The Game in Atlanta. I've said it a number of times, but at the same time, this is our reality. This is the new reality that we are going to exist in as college football fans, as people who exist in this world. And I just hope that next year, when we actually get into the situation, we are in this sort of situation where it's not just sort of like we'd only really have 2 teams. Let's just go back to the BCS. Hopefully it is something like this where that there are 5, 6, 7 teams who in any given season, any given Saturday could go out and win a football game. And I say that about Florida State, and I include them in that category because you know what? They're 13-0 and they've won every single game in front of them. And I think my hope for next season is that the teams and the matchups and everything else that happens and continues to happen in this metric, in this way. Because a lot of what we've seen over the last couple of years, there are only really 1 or 2 teams. Maybe there's a 3rd or a 4th, maybe. But generally there's 1, 2, or 3 teams. And that's why we've seen such lopsided college football playoff semifinals. But to your point, I don't think we have that this year. And so I really want to quickly jump into this. First and foremost, I just want you to give a thought or two. First, reactions about what you're going to be looking for in this game. Something, of course, we're going to have a whole month to talk about these games. This one's going to be the early game over there in the Rose Bowl, 4:00. Of course, out there on the West Coast, one of the most beautiful scenes in all of college football is the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all. I don't know if you can really even call it that anymore because it's not really what this is intended for, these 2 teams necessarily. Michigan is one, but not exactly. Alabama feels a little dirty whenever a team that's not the Pac-12 or the Big Ten plays in this game to me. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think this all comes down to which quarterback can really step up. Because I think Blake Corum is going to do Blake Corum things. He's a great player. We know who he is. J.J. McCarthy feels like he's a quarterback trending down. He struggled against better competition in these last 3 weeks, 3 defenses that are pretty good. I just omitted Maryland, unfortunately. I don't mean you. I mean Penn State. I mean Ohio State. I mean Iowa. The 3 ranked opponents that he's played here down the stretch. He's trended down. Jalen Milroe's done the opposite. He's done nothing but shine late in this season. He's been clutch when it matters most. Can he be clutch again against a Wolverine defense that has been one of the best groups in all of America this year?
Well, I disagree with you about J.J. McCarthy, and we talked about it 2 weeks ago. I know the numbers weren't eye-popping. I actually thought he was outstanding against Ohio State. Yeah. But to your point, I also disagree with you about Blake Corum. We just saw what Alabama did to limit Georgia's rushing attack, and I think you're going to see a lot of the same. I don't think Blake Corum is set up for a big game. I do think, as you pointed out, it is J.J. McCarthy who's going to have to step up.
Yeah.
And whether it's 300 yards or whether it's his legs or whether it's efficiency or 1 or 2 big throws here or whatever the metric is, I do think it is going to be up to him because Alabama, with the physicality that they showed against Georgia, if they can repeat that effort with a healthy, by then, Jace McClellan, I think and Jalen Milroe obviously performing the way you've detailed it, and he was outstanding and has been for quite a while now. Michigan's going to have his hands full. All right, Michigan's going to have its hands full physically and athletically in a way that they have not yet this year. The same way this is a team unlike one that Georgia had faced with respect to Ohio State. I think Alabama's a different type of beast. Alabama, it almost feels is specifically set up to beat Michigan. Just in terms of the physicality, yeah. Michigan wants to run the ball. Alabama's going to stop the run. It creates some very intriguing matchups in this game. I'm very excited to see this one. I don't know what the line is, but I imagine it's pretty small.
I have to imagine it's going to be pretty small. But
yeah.
When I made the comment about J.J. McCarthy, it's more.
I knew what you meant.
His efficiency is there. His efficiency has been strong. It's just this isn't the type of game that you're going to. So he had 60 yards against Penn State.
He's probably going to need more than 150
against Maryland.
Yeah, he's going to need more than
148 against Ohio State and 147 against Iowa. Some of those games he didn't really need to step up in a big spot and be explosive or whatever. Alabama, you're going to need to do a little bit more than that, because I think that's by far Alabama's by far going to have the best offense of any team that he's played all season. I mean, Ohio State has some great playmakers, but
they never found out how to put it together. Yeah,
they never put it all together, and which feels like just a
waste.
Service. It's a waste of all of the talent that was up there that they never put it all together. You have those players and those dudes, and you couldn't figure it out. Not the point of where we're trying to go with this. I'm just saying you need more than $150 if you're going to want to contend and play with Alabama in this game. I don't know, man. I tend to lean Alabama.
I absolutely lean Alabama because early on. I do think I don't want to give a disservice to how physical Michigan can be. Because I do think they can be very
We've
good.
Seen what happens when that sort of physicality, I just put it in quotations. They're a very physical bunch. They're Joe Moore award-winning offensive line the last 2 years. Like, look, this is a really good team. But we saw what happened when they went on down to the Orange Bowl and played Georgia. Of course, this is a different football team.
Yeah.
Both of these are 2 radically different football teams than what we saw there. But they got bullied against a team that's like, hey, we want to come in and run the damn ball. Okay, great. Do it. Try it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And consistently, that hasn't worked for the Big Ten whenever they play an SEC team.
Right.
It just consistently doesn't work. And generally speaking, when I see a Big Ten team playing an SEC team, I tend to lean to the SEC team. And just because they have the team speed on defense, this is a really good Michigan team. Blake Corum, I think, is a beast. But you made a good point. They have figured out that rush defense, and they're just one of the hottest teams in America. They really have been over the last couple of months. And they have the best win of anybody in the country in that SEC Championship game. I think it's going to be a fascinating matchup. It's going to be one that's going to just have so many storylines, of course, with Jim Harbaugh and all the drama that's coming on off the field. Does he start flirting with the NFL again? I think there's a not zero chance that starts happening over here the next couple of weeks. At least he starts hearing some of those questions. But let's move down to the Sugar Bowl, my childhood favorite bowl game, the Sugar. Washington in Texas. I think this actually makes for a really fascinating matchup too, because just like we just talked about the quarterbacks, I'm actually not going to look at the quarterbacks here because both quarterbacks, of course, we know all four quarterbacks in this are very interesting. They're all unique. They're all their own types of players. I don't think any one of them is anything like the others. They're great in this one too. Michael Penix and Quinn Ewers, of course. I'm looking specifically at the skill players. I think the skill players here are the best of anybody in this tournament. And it's Rome Odunze, it's Jalen McMillan, it's Dylan Johnson, it's Xavier Worthy, it's A.D. Mitchell, it's JT Sanders. They got dudes all over the field. And it's going to be so much fun to watch those guys just sort of get out there and play.
Yeah, it's interesting. Normally, I would come out here and tell you that with the elite rush defense that Texas has, Washington is in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But with the big plays that Texas's defense gives up in the pass game, and you've got, as you mentioned, a McMillan and a Rome Odunze and Michael Penix spinning it out to him, that almost cancels out potentially the ability to stop the run. This is a very interesting matchup. I think the first aspect I'm going to look for, and we won't know until game day, is what Washington team shows up. Is this the one that we just saw really take it to Oregon, who I still believe is a very, very good team? Or is this the one that sleptwalked through about 5 or 6 games between the 2 wins over Oregon, the midseason one and the Pac-12 tournament one? And then for Texas, they've got to continue to build on that run game. The playmakers offensively, defensively have really showed up, and Quinn Ewers just has to be good. He was very good against Oklahoma State, but we've seen a couple games where like you're randomly watching him and he's like 10 of 20 and you're trying to figure out what's going on. So in the same way, I need to see Quinn Ewers in that game. There's a lot more variables in this game between Washington and Texas than I would say between Michigan and Alabama, because I don't think it's a situation where one team's going to just come in and just manhandle and out physical the other team. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely spot on. This is going to come down to the skill position players, and we've seen a lot of deep passes from Quinn Ewers to open receivers. We've seen the exact same thing from Michael Penix, and it'll be interesting to see who can hit for more big plays in the Sugar Bowl. I think that's what this game will come down to.
I think it makes for 2 very fascinating matchups, 2 matchups that we're going to be talking a lot about over here on College Football Overtime over the course of the next month. But of course, we have tons of great bowl games. We have New Year's 6 games that we got to break down. We'll talk about all of those over the course of the next couple of weeks. We are very much looking forward to them. Lots of dialogue, transfer portal conversations, coaching transitions. All of that is going to be discussed because the transfer portal opens up Monday. So we are really excited to talk about that because we're about to have some chaos there too. You thought the college football playoff was chaotic. Just wait until you see all these names that are about to pop up in the transfer portal. Abe, this is going to be crazy. I'm glad you're here along for the ride. Make sure you are too. Those of you who are listening, drop that subscribe button right down there. Make sure you like, make sure you follow, make sure you check out all that we have to offer because it's college football season and college football never sleeps, especially now that it's in bowl season. This is the craziness that we know and love, and it gets a little bit crazier. The college football playoff, we figured out who our 4 teams are. We're going to be breaking it all down right here on College Football Overtime. So make sure you are here. Coming up on Thursday morning, we got more conversation coming. So make sure you have that subscribed. Make sure you're here. We'll see you on Thursday. We cannot wait. Been a crazy week. We'll talk more about it next week.